we are talking about and maybe what we're not talking about when we say shoulder. Here's an example. We have precedent. Is this ankle motion?
No.
Yeah, so we have precedent that not everything that we may perceive as shoulder is shoulder. Okay, so it's not a new concept, it's just applied to a different place in the body. Okay, so keep in mind the function of what we call the shoulder girdle. We have pelvic girdle, which is basically all of the different articulations in that cement block around the pelvis. And we have our shoulder girdle, all the different, I don't know why I'm scrapping and stuff, but all the different articulations that make up this overall arm appendage. So shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle are general concepts. Lower leg, upper arm. And it's just, you know, it's general. It means a lot of different things. Okay? There are 4 main articulations at the shoulder girdle. And it all starts, when I say starts, what's actually connecting your upper extremity to your thorax, truly the thing that is articulating your upper extremity to your thorax is right here. Your sternum, clavicular, clavicle, sternoclavicular joint. In other words, when I do this, the son of a gun goes up and down. When I do this, the son of a gun goes up and down. And even when I do this, it gives some rotation. Right? So the sternoclavicular joint is our first articulation. Now, we don't associate motions with it. It moves, but we don't say like sternoclavicular joint abduction. And I'll get to the main reason why. Does it make sense that if I have a baton, you know, in track you pass the baton from one person to another? So the sternum is a runner, and the scapula is a runner, and the baton is passed through the clavicle. That's one way to kind of look at it. All right, so let's take a look at this picture. All right? So my point is that if I have a baton that's connected to the sternum and the scapula, it's impossible for me to move the scapula and the baton not go, not move. I mean, unless I'm dislocated or disassociated with it. I mean, if the scapula moves, then the baton has no choice but to move. Okay? So the first articulation, sternoclavicular joint. Well, if the clavicle is the baton passing it from one to another, sternoclavicular on one end, and I know I'm using 2 hands, it's usually going to be the same hand, but let's just pretend. We're doing the electrical current game. So the clavicle on the other end passes the baton to the scapula. Now, the scapula is a bone, but it has a lot of little nubs and stuff that are called different things. But those things like the acromion and the coracoid, bless you, and the spine, that's just areas of the bone. It's not separate bones. The analogy I gave you when we were talking about the malleoli is that Louisiana is a state, but we have different regions, right? We have Acadiana, and then there's South Lafourche. That's always fun and interesting. We have North Louisiana, right? If someone says, where are you from? You may say from North Louisiana, because that region is just different. It's still cool, but it's different. Like, usually when people ask me where I'm from, I don't say Delcom, because they have no clue where Delcom's at. People in Lafayette probably don't know, some of them don't know where Delcom's at. So I'll say South Louisiana, a region, an area. So we have to keep in mind that that scapula is one bone, but there's a lot of little bony nubs and a lot of different things, muscles are pulling and some mechanical advantages. And those little nubs have names, regions. I guess you could almost kind of think of it as parishes too, right? I mean, it's one state, but it's made up of a lot of different parishes, a lot of different regions. And those parishes are made up of cities, okay? So the connection, the baton pass from the sternum to the scapula connects at the acromioclavicular joint. Now, why do we say acromion and not scapula? Because the next articulation is scapulothoracic. So to avoid confusion, we just say, hey, that sternum connects to the clavicle, and then that clavicle connects to a part of the scapula called the acromion. That's all it is. And the acromion is just this little lateral hook on the outside. Great for muscle attachments and pulling. And again, most of these little bony nubs are just mechanical advantage nubs that evolved from the bone to give our muscles better leverage. Okay? So the acromion is an area of the scapula, but technically it's still the clavicle connected to the scapula. Right? Now this joint right here, the acromioclavicular joint, common sprains to this are just direct shots to the shoulder, where you take that collarbone, right, that clavicle, and you deviate it from where it's connecting, and you can have a sprain. In fact, in high school, I was a junior, and I sprained my AC joint. But I was terrified, I didn't know anything about anatomy. And the doctor said, you separated your shoulder. Well, I was, again, terrified. I was, a pitcher, and I was, using my arms a lot. But it was that specific joint. It wasn't my ball and socket joint, right? So the AC joint, the acromioclavicular joint, technically it's still scapula and collarbone and clavicle. Then we have sledgehammer, apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. I'm going to get to the glenohumeral joint last, because that's the one we're going to be lecturing on today in terms of motion. So know that there's another synovial ball and socket joint, but I'm going to get to the sledgehammer. I'm going to get to the one that's different. I'm going to get to the one that's unique, and that is the scapulothoracic articulation. Notice there is no J after that. Joints have capsules. Joints have fluid. Joints have axes about which the motion takes place. Scapula is just kind of floating back. It's not, there's no capsule, it's just kind of hanging out. Now, what maintains its presence on the thorax? Negative pressure, that's kind of a fun concept to think about. Suction. And muscles. Think about this. Have you ever seen someone at a party do the little trick where they reach back there and their scapula like wings out like by 3 inches? And you go, yeah, that's good. So in other words, you can't do that with synovial joints. Things with capsules, you can't. So that's kind of showing how it's really just kind of floating there. And based on the tonicity of your muscles and your genetic disposition for negative pressure, suction on there, it may kind of flare out a little bit. Right? So we don't call it a joint, we call it an articulation, because technically it's kind of floating on the ribs. You have muscles that pass in between there too, right? So we can't really have it connect to something, or those muscles would get ripped apart. We kind of have to let it kind of glide and float. I like to look at it as orbiting planets around the sun. I know this is a real weird analogy, but I'm a weird dude. Your heart, what was that movie, Frozen? What, she froze your heart. Frozen 2 coming out, yay. Let's pretend your heart is the sun, and your scapula kind of orbits around. Like if you think of the ribs as kind of angled, making an orbital path. So my scapula can kind of float forward and back and just kind of orbit based on the contour of the ribs. And the ribs also kind of contour up and down. So the scapula kind of floats along the natural curves of the ribs. It's pretty cool. And we're going to have motions for the scapula. Keep in mind that scapula floating around the ribs ultimately helps our functional circle of reach. What I mean by that is, if I were going to reach forward and only move my shoulder, I would feel like a T-Rex. You know, the little T-Rex. Right? So, I'm trying, guys. So, check out the extra motion I get with floating my scapula around my rib. That was all scapula. Reach forward, flexion, scapula orbiting. I mean, you get a lot of extra motion because of the scapula. Now, the last joint I'm going to talk about, that glenohumeral joint, the glenoid fossa is the socket, the little suction cup. It's like a golf tee. And the humerus, obviously, the ball, the head of the humerus. it's connected to the scapula. So in other words, anytime I move my scapula, guess who has to go along for the ride? That's why when you orbit your scapula, the whole arm is going to go along for the ride. Right? Everything attached to it. So scapular motion is going to be of importance after we talk about glenohumeral joint motion, shoulder motion, because it's helping us in our functional circles of reach, up, down, front, back. And I'm going to show you how the scapula actually leans. It repositions itself to keep that golf ball on that golf tee for us to get over our head. That's probably going to be I say the toughest. It won't be tough. You're here, you're listening, and I'm going to teach you how when you get your hand 180 degrees, all that's not clock. Not all of it is clock hand. Some of it is literally rotating the clock itself, so that way globally you can get your hand at 180. But locally to the glenohumeral joint, it's about 120. And then the clock actually does a little 60-degree, little something. So glenohumeral joint. This is a true synovial joint. Diarthritic. What's the classification? Ball and socket, triaxial. In anatomical position, we're going to be accountable for 6 motions, right? 2 sagittal, 2 frontal, 2 transverse. And then we have this variation of away into 6 o'clock, right? When I take my clock and I put it like this, I can go away from 6 or towards 6. And we call that horizontal variation to that in abduction. So a lot of stuff happening there. Yes, sir.
All right, so you have sternoclavicular joint, you have the scapulothoracic, then you have the glenohumeral.
It's all in here. Yeah. So that could be a good reference. Or
I didn't see it in there.
What's that?
I didn't see it in there.
Well, then what I would do is I would take out your book. You have it with you? What I would do is, that's a good point, and just write in, so that way you don't, now you may be a great artist, I'm not a great artist, but what I would do is I would just make little like notes and be like, so that way you don't have to, because you have to do double time when you have to draw and write.
So I just want to go over the joints one time.
Yeah, absolutely.
One time.
Hey, not a problem. And again, guys, here's, first of all, I'm glad you pointed that out. But here's my dilemma. I assume you guys kind of know that stuff from anatomy. So if you don't, because they're like, nah, dude, all they did was do physiology, I need to hear that, right? You need to slow me down, because I'm looking at it as a kind of a review, and then we get into the good stuff of the motion. So I'm glad you brought that point that, nah, dude, in our lab we didn't, we didn't do any of that. So I need that kind of feedback, okay? I need you guys to slow me down when we need to. But so what I'm suggesting is take out your book. Maybe this may help, maybe it doesn't. But take out your book to the shoulder joint, and you can like basically draw a little arrow. Like I have a couple pictures there, the shoulder girdle. So you could literally just draw an arrow to the sternoclavicular joint, or draw an arrow to the acromioclavicular joint. But the reality is that most of these, all of these really, are bony insinuatory, if that makes sense. The sternoclavicle joint, where the sternum meets up with the clavicle. Let's see, what page is the little thing? 20, 32, 32. Let's see, right here, buddy. And that way, so let's start here, and we'll go sternoclavicular. So you just draw a little line and do sternoclavicular, but again, sternum to clavicle. And then clavicle to acromion, and this is where I told you that acromion is technically part of the scapula, but it's just an area of the scapula. It's a bony prominence. We're going to talk about coracoid processes, and heck, the malleoli, there's precedent, right? Your medial malleoli is part of your tibia, but it's an extra nubby thing that we give a certain name to. So sternoclavicular joint. This one is acromioclavicular joint. Good. AC. And again, that's the baton pass. It's literally just transferring from the thorax to the upper extremity. Because again, something's got to connect our limbs to our, when you're putting together, figures, you have to connect it some kind of way. Something has to connect our arms to our body. It's here. And then we slowly transition out, right? Okay? Acromioclavicular joint. I would mark the scapulothoracic articulation on the picture to the left. That's what I would do. Because that's a good view of how the scapula is just kind of floating back there, right? So that's how I would identify it. I would identify it with that other picture. And then the last one, the glenohumeral joint, the GH joint, is going to be literally the ball and the socket. And again, some people overthink these things, which I totally understand. I overthink a lot of things myself. But that is still a ball and socket. Even though it doesn't have much of a socket, it's still a socket. Do y'all remember Vern Troyer from Austin Powers? The little Vern, he was on Austin Powers. Was he any less of a man because he was small? Of course not. He's still just as much of a person as we are. So size doesn't matter to the concept of the ball and socket joint. In other words, it doesn't matter if the socket is this or if it's this. It's still a socket. Okay? So it's still a ball and socket concept. The reason we have that shallow socket is so that we can add more in mobility. But it's still a socket, okay? So again, guys, I really appreciate that. You got to let me know, and you did, and I appreciate that. There's a lot of these things I just kind of assume, but what's one of our commandments? Do not assume. So I'm going to do my best to not assume as well, okay? So the key thing here, guys, is that when we're going to be moving our arms, that whole shoulder girdle, every single part in there is going to be doing something to help the cause. Now, in terms of communicating motion, only 2 of those 4 articulations get discussed when dealing with motion. The glenohumeral joint, and it's going to have all the same motions as the hip. Guys, it's the exact same. It looks different. There's some illusions. I'm going to teach you that. But it follows the exact same rules. Looks like I'm doing some kind of 98 degrees dance. But it follows all the same rules as the shoulder. And then I'm going to teach you about scapular motion, how that scapula can orbit different ways around the thorax to help reposition the socket. Guys, you only have so much. Let's do a quick review. The actual part of bones that articulate and glide, they're very smooth, right? They have that special kind of cartilage that starts with an H. What was that called again? Hyaline cartilage, yeah. You only have so much of that hyaline cartilage, and the last thing you want is to articulate non-hyaline with the socket, right? That's a bad day. So the point is that you only have so much articulation before, watch this happen. This is my left glenohumeral joint, this is my scapula, right? Because the socket is part of the scapula. Watch this, how cool. You only have so much before you run out of articulating space. So what the scapula can do is lean, where you still have the same relative angle, but because the scapula can reposition the socket, you can get your arm a little bit higher. And my job is to teach you that 180 degrees is not all at the shoulder. That some of that is the repositioning of the scapula so that you can reach above your head. It's pretty cool. Okay? Okay. Great start. Any follow-up questions? Again, guys, anatomy, what's what? Now's the time to ask. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get to, here's another great picture. So look, there's that articulating surface right there. We got to keep the golf ball on the golf tee. And in biomechanics, what's fun about biomechanics class is when I'm lecturing about the shoulder biomechanics, you already know the motions. So in biomechanics, when I'm doing shoulder lecture, now we're talking about the muscles, the different muscles that cross and pull in directions of motion, but also they can work together to aid into the stability, to keep that golf ball on that golf tee. We don't want that golf ball blowing off because that's a bad day, right? All right, good job. Good job. All right, motion. So follow along in your book or take notes. If you don't have it, it's all good. Yes, sir.
The coracoid process, is that just like a protrusion coming from the bone, or does it have something to do with the motion of
Oh, great.
the joint?
I'm gonna answer your question. It has nothing. It's part of the scapula. Indirectly, it has something to do with motions because you have muscles that are pulling on that sucker. So you have pec minor pulls on that coracobrachialis, biceps brachii short head. So you're going to have muscles that are leveraging that hook to yank to influence motion. But unless you break it off, wherever it moves, the whole scapula is going to move with it.
So it's kind of like stuck in place, but it gives a little leeway based on how the muscles move.
There's no leeway. It's literally part of the bone. Yeah, it's not like it's not a dangly thing. It gets stiff. But you have muscles that are tugging on that scapula that are pulling the interior. So how cool to have a little prominence, a little peninsula that comes out so that they can yank on it and pull. Does that make sense?
The muscle almost like wraps around it like a hook, right?
Well, I mean, it goes straight to it, but it's like, if I could think of an analogy. You know, the handrails kind of jet out so that I can kind of have some mechanical advantage of influencing the door motion. So your coracoid kind of jets out posterior to anterior so that those muscles don't have to go all the way in the back to pull. They kind of have a little shortcut. Hey, I'll just pull on this little piece. But the piece doesn't wiggle, the piece doesn't, you know, that piece is part of the scapula itself. It's a good question. In fact, let me, while we're on it. So yeah, this is part of, look, you see how it jets out? But it's actually part of the scapula itself. Yeah. Awesome. Okay guys, shoulder motions. Remember, ESPN has been fooling you for years, okay? So what we need to remember is that there's no such thing as arm flexion or arm, you know, it's joints, man, joints. Or think of it like this, how many times as kids you're like, flex your muscles, right? And I'm not, that's okay for that, but muscles contract. muscles don't flex, joints flex. I'm just giving you an example of how easy some of these kind of false concepts creep in our brain and why I gotta scrub it out of there. So there's no such thing as arm extension because I have several joints that make up my arm and one joint doesn't speak for all of them. My elbow could be extended, but my elbow does not speak for my whole arm, right? So the main thing to keep into mind is the concept of what does it mean to be flexed, or what does it mean to have flexion. It's all about fetal position. It really is. It's about fetal. That's why, like the thumb actually flexes in a different dimension than the fingers because it's going into a ball. It has technically nothing to do with the plane. Yeah, getting into a ball happens to be mostly sagittal, but you're going to get into a ball by doing this with your thumb. That's flexion. Okay? So how can I best get into a ball with the contribution of the shoulder? Let me show you what it's not. Ah! You see what I'm saying? And this, when I bring everything else back to anatomical, I know it looks like I'm doing the Macarena, that's shoulder flexion. So don't get caught up with full extension, extended, make sure you extend out. That's, and again, guys, I'm not fussing it though, they just don't know. They're using maybe the elbow's position to speak for an entire arm that's made up of different joints and different segments that have to be communicated independently. I'm sure you don't want people speaking for you, and my shoulder's like, I don't want people speaking for me. Your arm doesn't have a motion. The joints that make up the arm have independent motions. This one being shoulder flexion. Now, just like the hips, Flexion, extension, ab and adduction is going to be from the perspective of the socket. And internal and external rotation is going to be from the perspective of the long bone. This is why. Because if I looked at flexion and extension from the perspective of the long bone, let's pretend I had two little eyes on my puny little biceps, and they were looking forward. And I said, flexion, extension from your perspective. Well, if I kept my bicep looking at the room and did this, does that look like flexion and extension to you? You know? Going away. So flexion, extension, ab and adduction is from the perspective of the socket. That way, you could be internally rotated, flex, extend. You could be in anatomical position, flex, extend. You could be externally rotated, flex, extended, because it's from the perspective of the socket. That way, you could be internally rotated, like my empty can people you do in your therapy exercise at the clinic. You could be internally rotated and still have ab and adduction. You could be neutral and still have ab and adduction. You could be externally rotated and still have ab. So by doing it that way, it gives unto Caesar what is Caesar's. It's basically saying, listen, I don't care what rotational position you're in. If I'm moving in my socket sagittal plane, I'm getting more in the fetal or less in the fetal. How is this getting more in the fetal position, right? If we made it from the perspective of the long bone. Don't feel sorry for the long bone. It has rotation perspective. That's pretty cool. But it has to be from the socket's perspective for the reasons I give you, okay? So, shoulder flexion, it doesn't matter if I'm here, it doesn't matter. Flexion and extension of the shoulder. Into fetal, away from fetal. This would be extended. This would be flexing to anatomical, flexing from anatomical. That was on your first test. Ab and adduction follow the same rules as the hip. Well, all the shoulder motions follow the same rules as the hip. It's just you have more of it. That's all it is. And remember in the video, I said the biggest trap is when you use midline concepts to try to learn these motions, and we say no, I'm still rotating the exact same way. It's and then just like the door would be open and but again, when you use these midline kind of concepts, that could, you know, ab all the way up, add all the way down. Okay. So shoulder, glenohumeral joint. I'm gonna try to mimic it, and then on Friday I'll bring in the skeleton. The skeleton doesn't move very well. Ball, socket, left shoulder. Flexion, extension. Internal or medial, they're synonyms. External or lateral. Remember the lecture on the knee. In open chain is where we first reference these things. In open chain, that's how we in open chain. That just means the smallest piece is moving about the bigger piece. That's an easy layman's way to look at it. When I'm opening up a bottle of water, typically I move the smaller piece about the bigger piece. So that's why I say lefty loosey, righty tighty, because it's the smaller piece moving about the bigger piece. But as I told you, I can also open it by spinning the bottle the other way. I can open it by spinning the bottle to the right. I get the same motion open. So just like with the hip, hey, right leg, spin laterally. Well, that's the smaller mass segment from what it's rotating about. Right leg, spin laterally. Right shoulder, spin laterally or externally. Hey, right leg, right hip, spin medially or internally. Hey, right shoulder, spin medially. Same thing. Trick is, one of the illusion tricks, to get into a ball, my elbows are going to flex forward, my knees are going to flex back. So that adds to the illusion of this. In other words, they're doing the same thing. I'm internally rotating my shoulder and my hip, and I'm externally rotating my shoulder and my hip. The difference is that because my elbow flexes forward, my hand follows the rotation of the shoulder. In other words, when I internally rotate, my hand happens to come in. But because my knee flexes back, when I internally rotate, my foot goes out. But remember, learning motions shouldn't be about memorizing what segments do. It should be about seeing how the bone is moving and what it articulates with. Plant that seed, internal rotate, external rotate. Doesn't matter, that's just a distraction. Internal rotation, external rotation. Internal rotation, external rotation. Okay. Question? We're good? No, it's all good. I just want to make sure. Okay? We have variations of ab and adduction, just like the hip. So like let's say you go into one of those little hip machines and you're doing horizontal AB and adduction from your pelvis's perspective of transverse versus frontal. Same thing in the shoulders. I can have horizontal ab and horizontal ad. Horizontal ad, when my thorax isn't in the way, allows my hands to clap together. Regular ad, my hands don't necessarily clap together because my body gets in the way. But if I were to snap it out of existence, they would just keep going and do the same thing. Okay? So again, horizontal AB and adduction, the way I'd like for you to think about it is, it's not new motions. It's just variations of one of the motions. It's a variation. It's specifically away or towards 6 o'clock in the trunk's transverse plane. That's all it is. But you're really technically doing something very similar. In other words, horizontal, guess what? My clock hand's back at 6. So when I extend, I'm back to where I started. That's all it is. It's just that I didn't take the same road. I took a different road, but that's how I got my clock hand back, is by doing the horizontal instead of the regular . Okay. Shoulder motion. Shoulder motion. There is, as you can probably imagine, a lot of combinational planes with shoulder movement, okay? On the test, I'm not going to go super crazy and give you, Neos dodging bullets and stuff. At the most, I might give you a combinational motion where some of it is flexion, some of it is abduction. And yeah, not here. But again, that's like north, east, northeast. And how I would communicate specifically which one I wanted is planes. If I did this and I said, what's the sagittal component of that? From here to here, the sagittal component would be the flexion component. And would be the frontal component, that'd be the abduction. So this is just a combination of flexion and abduction happening at the same time. That's all it is. It's moving two knobs on the Etch-a-Sketch at the same time. And how that happens is, well, I got some muscles that pull me forward, I got some muscles that pull me out. What happens if both of them pull at the same time with the same force? They work together to synergistically bring you where you want to go. I guess another way to look at it, it's no different than, let's say I wanted to move this table there. Well, if I push this way, at the same time someone else is pushing that way, we can work together to send it in a straight line in a combinational direction. Same thing. Same thing. Okay? Cool? All right, let's do some practice, okay? So, what's fair game? I'm not going to put in the scapula yet, but fair game is wrist, elbow, radial ulnar joint, shoulder. I will communicate what I'm asking, or I'll leave it open-ended sometimes and say, what did you observe? What did you see? Okay? All right, first one. Think, 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 think. Okay, this is my start position. Okay? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Did I ever tell you like I'm so silly. When I do this, that's my way of shaking the Etch-a-Sketch. You know, like after you play with the Etch-a-Sketch, you shake it to start all over, right? It's like I do a motion and then I go back to where I started. Okay? Start position. Now, should it matter that I went fast? No, it shouldn't matter. Because you understand that motion is changing position. And you're going to be observing and analyzing athletes who are going to be moving fast, a heck of a lot faster than I could ever move. You're going to have to be able to see change in position. Sometimes it gets, I say so bad, it's just a developed skill. The more you do it, the better you get. Sometimes you're literally looking at blurs. You know, you move fast and you see blurs, but those blurs tell you dimensions. And those blurs infer motion. And you can literally play back those blurs to literally see everything that's happening in a motion that typically your eyes can't process. It takes time. Okay? What did you guys observe? I'm going to ask it this way. Instead of just getting right down to joint motions, what joint are you very confident that had motion in it? Open-ended question, don't tell me how, just give me a joint that you know had motion in it. Okay? Shoulders where I'd put my money on, right? Like in terms of just the most obvious. Okay? I definitely, I'm not saying there wasn't, but I'm turning, if I had to put money on one thing that happened, I'd put my money on, you know, on the thing that had the most observable motion. So let's analyze the shoulders. Do we just say, well, the shoulders had abduction and adduction? Is that a good way of being a good communicator to shoulder motion? What would be a better means of communication? Speaking of them independently as two different joints and saying, well, the left did something and the right did something. And sometimes they do the same thing, but they don't have to. Okay? So what did the left shoulder do? Adduction, right? Yeah, it adducted. Yeah, it adduct. Yeah. The concept of moving in a direction of adduction, outstanding. Okay. What did the right shoulder do? Ababa. Now again, people that may not understand local concepts, they may say, well, I don't understand. They're doing the same thing globally, right? You know, like if they were a pendulum. You see how that could be confusing to some people? But I don't get it. They're both swinging the same way. And my reply would be like, you're absolutely right. From the room's perspective, they are swinging the same way. But how do we communicate joint motions? Not from the room's perspective. From the joint's perspective. So do you see why that was important at the beginning of the semester to differentiate between global and local references? Is to show you that just because two things look like they're doing the same thing, to the room, they're not doing the same thing to the joints. Okay? So left shoulder, adduction, outstanding. What did the right shoulder do? Abba-ba-ba-ba. So left shoulder, add-da-da-da-da. Right shoulder, abba-ba-ba-ba. Okay? What else was super obvious? With joint. Not the wrist. Close. It lives very close to the wrist.
Oh, radio.
Yeah. And this is good, guys. This is good, man. This is us practicing our verbiage. That's how tempting it is, right? To say wrist, because it's right there. Radioulnar joint. So, what position did I start my radioulnar joints at? Yeah, pronated. Now, if you're having a tough time seeing it, just remember the radioulnar joint has nothing to do with any of the other joints. So I could bring everything back to anatomical and see where my position started for my radioulnar joint. Whether that's here or whether it helps you to flex your shoulders to see it, this is where I started. Now maybe I stay there, but I didn't, right? I did this. So let me bring everything back and whoa, I went from here to here. Now for that motion, you don't have to. You could say left and right radioulnar joint supination. But there's a word for when both sides do so. Yeah, bilateral, both sides. Hey, both Sides, both radial ulnar joints supinated. Bilateral radial ulnar joint supination, the act of going supine for the radial ulnar joint. It has nothing to do with soup bowls, man. My last name's Campbell. I'm all about the soup. It's about the concept of going supine or the concept of going prone to that radius. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. Oh, what a great question. What a beautiful question. So the first thing is that although two separate joints, they do work a lot together, right? So the best way to look at the shoulder internal external rotation is to have a landmark of the humerus itself. So like remember when I'm doing the hip, I'll plant a flag so that you could see, hey, look how it's rotating. It's the same thing. If I plant the flag in my bicep and do this, is my shoulder rotating? No. But watch what happens when I do this or this. Right? So the answer to your question is that you will literally see the humerus spin. Like if I'm going to try to make my hand do a 180, I can't do all that with my radial ulnar joint. But watch what happens. Pronation, pronation, pronation. I ran out of room. Shoulder starts to rotate. So the clues are in the clothing. The clues are in the clothing. When I start to rotate my hip, you see it in my clothing. If I don't rotate my hip, right? Even like the trunk, like it's hard to see inside, but not really. When I start to rotate my trunk, you're going to see it in the clothing. The clues are in the clothing. So we're going to work on it. It's not easy, but I'm going to teach you enough clues. And then remember, I taught you how the landmarks of the thumb and the pinky, right? So in other words, in a supinated position, thumb is lateral. And in a fully pronated position, the thumb switch over and it's medial, right? So that's also some clues for the radial ulnar joint. But the key thing for the shoulder is when I just look at bicep. I just look at the muscle that I know that's here, and if it stays put, I didn't move my shoulder. No rotation. And then when it starts to do this, then I have internal and external rotation. So the clues is in the clothing. But we're going to develop that. This is just introduction. Friday we're going to do a lot of examples and we're going to look at it. Here's another way to answer your question. I'm going to foreshadow because it's a great question. Motion, even though you may not see it, can be inferred with change in position, right? So in other words, you fall asleep and next thing you know, you wake up in Lake Charles. Well, you may have not felt yourself go west, but if you wake up in Lake Charles and you knew you started in Lafayette, you know you had to travel west. So I'll give you another example of how to see rotation in the shoulder when it may not be obvious. Let's go back to our upright row example, okay? And when I start, my biceps are kind of looking at each other. Is that correct? Like in other words, if I planted a flag, this is my bicep. So my biceps are looking at each other. Well, when I do this, they're no longer looking at each other. I started here, I ended there. You see what I'm getting to? So that's another way to see shoulder rotation is before and after stuff. Where did I start? Where did I finish? And then how did it have to move to get there? So I had to have external rotation. It's subtle and it's in combination with some other stuff. But that's actually the reason why my radial ulnar joint had to supinate, because it had to counter my shoulder trying to spin if I didn't move my radial ulnar joint. So the radial ulnar joint moving with the shoulder, as the shoulder wants to do this, my radial ulnar joint counters that by spinning the other way. But it still comes back to before and after pictures. Where did I start? Biceps are looking at each other. Where did I end? My biceps are not looking at each other, they're looking in the front of the class, so I had to have external rotation to get there. So different ways, I'm going to teach you different ways. And some techniques may work for some people, other techniques may work for other people. It's all good, you don't have to use one specific technique, but my job is to show you a lot of different ways to do it, and hopefully one of those ways works for you. Okay? We're getting to be that time. Okay, I'm going to cut out a couple minutes early so that way our roll sheet people can sum the roll.